There are educators who approach their profession with such thorough mastery of subject matter and such extensive experience managing classroom dynamics that they develop profound confidence in their ability to guide students through learning processes, who have taught the same curriculum so many times that they can anticipate where students will struggle and can provide precisely calibrated explanations that address common misunderstandings before they fully develop, who have refined their pedagogical methods over years or decades until teaching feels like performance of well-rehearsed routine rather than like uncertain navigation of complex intellectual territory. Samuel Hart had been such an educator for most of his 12 years teaching mathematics at Elmwood High School, a mid-sized public school serving approximately 1,200 students in grades 9 through 12 in suburban community approximately 30 miles from major metropolitan center. Had developed over those years the kind of confident competence that made him respected by colleagues and generally appreciated by students even when they found his classes challenging, had accumulated evidence through consistently strong student performance on standardized tests and through positive teaching evaluations that his methods were effective and that his understanding of both mathematics and pedagogy was solid. He was 41 years old, had come to teaching after a brief career in software development that had left him professionally successful but emotionally unfulfilled, had completed teaching certification through accelerated program designed for career changers who possess content expertise but lacked formal education training, had been hired at Elmwood immediately after certification based on combination of his mathematical background and the school's ongoing difficulty recruiting qualified math teachers. The transition from software development to education had been challenging, required learning entirely new skills set around classroom management and instructional design and assessment, required adjusting to institutional constraints and bureaucratic requirements that were foreign to someone accustomed to relatively autonomous professional environment of software engineering, required developing patience and communication skills appropriate to working with adolescents rather than with professional colleagues. But Samuel had adapted successfully, had discovered that he genuinely enjoyed the intellectual challenge of making complex mathematical concepts accessible to students with varying levels of preparation and aptitude, had found satisfaction in the relationships he developed with students and in observing their growth over academic year. His teaching style had evolved into an approach that combined clear, structured explanations with opportunities for student practice and problem solving, that emphasized understanding conceptual foundations rather than just memorizing procedures, that maintained high expectations while also providing support for students who were struggling. The approach was effective by most conventional measures. His students performed well on district and state assessments. Most reported feeling that they'd learned mathematics effectively in his classes. His classroom management was solid enough that discipline issues were minimal and learning time was protected from disruption. Elmwood High School itself was typical of suburban American public schools, serving predominantly middle-class communities, mixture of students from professional families and from working-class families, racial and ethnic diversity that reflected changing demographics of American suburbs, but that was still predominantly white, academic culture that emphasized college preparation for most students, while also offering vocational and technical pathways for students not pursuing traditional four-year degrees. The building was constructed in the 1970s and showed its age, worn linoleum floors and fluorescent lighting, and beige concrete block walls that created institutional atmosphere despite various attempts at making spaces more welcoming through student artwork and motivational posters. Classrooms that were functional but not particularly inspiring with their rows of combination desk chair units and whiteboards and the various educational technology that had been added piecemeal over years as funding became available. Samuel's classroom was room 217, second floor space with windows overlooking the student parking lot and the athletic field beyond, furnished with 35 desk chair combinations arranged in traditional rows facing the front where Samuel would typically stand or sit at teacher's desk while delivering instruction. The walls displayed the usual educational materials, posters showing mathematical formulas and geometric relationships, number lines spanning one wall for visual reference, bulletin board where Samuel posted exemplary student work and announcements about upcoming assessments. The room was organized and clean but not particularly distinctive, reflected Samuel's pragmatic approach to creating functional learning environment rather than attempting to establish particular aesthetic or atmosphere beyond basic professionalism. The fall semester of the school year in question, specifically mid-October, approximately 6 weeks into the academic year. Samuel was teaching 3 sections of algebra, serving primarily 9th grade students, and 2 sections of geometry, serving primarily 10th grade students. The geometry course was considered moderately challenging within Elmwood's curriculum, covered standard topics of Euclidean geometry, including congruence and similarity, properties of triangles and quadrilaterals and circles, coordinate geometry, and basic three-dimensional geometry. Most students who enrolled had completed Algebra I successfully the previous year and were continuing their standard mathematics sequence that would lead eventually to Algebra II and possibly pre-calculus, and calculus if they remain on accelerated track. Into this established educational environment, during the first weeks of October, arrived transfer student named Kiran Desai, who was enrolling at Elmwood after relocating with his family from a different state where he'd been attending different school system. Kiran was 12 years old, younger than typical 10th grade student by approximately 2 years, had apparently been accelerated in his previous school district based on demonstrated mathematical aptitude that exceeded age-level expectations, was being placed in geometry despite his age because placement assessments had indicated he would prepare for the course's content, and because maintaining his accelerated trajectory seemed appropriate given his previous academic performance. Samuel's first impression of Kiran, formed during the boy's initial week in the geometry class, was that he was quiet and somewhat reserved student who was probably navigating the social and academic adjustments that transfer students typically face when entering new school mid-year. Kiran sat toward middle of the classroom, paid careful attention during instruction, completed his work during practice periods without needing assistance, participated minimally in class discussions but responded appropriately when called upon directly. Nothing about his initial presentation suggested that he would become the student who would fundamentally challenge Samuel's understanding of teaching and learning, who would create the experiences that would transform Samuel's pedagogical practice in ways that 12 years of previous teaching experience hadn't achieved. The moment that initiated this transformation occurred on Monday, October 17th, during the 4th period geometry class, where Samuel was teaching unit on triangle properties and specifically on the angle bisector theorem, geometric principle stating that angle bisector of triangle divides the opposite side into segments proportional to the other 2 sides. Samuel had presented the theorem's formal statement and proof, had worked through several example problems demonstrating how to apply the theorem in various contexts, had assigned practice problems for students to work on individually, while he circulated to provide assistance where needed. The classroom during this practice period had the typical atmosphere of productive, if not particularly inspired learning. Most students were working through problems with varying levels of engagement. Some were concentrating intently, while others were working more mechanically without deep thought. Few were struggling enough to raise their hands for assistance, while most were managing adequately on their own. Samuel was moving among the rows, answering occasional questions, and observing student work to identify common errors or misunderstandings that might need to be addressed with whole class before the period concluded. He was approximately halfway through his circulation when Kiran raised his hand, not with the urgent waving that characterized students who were completely stuck and needed immediate help, but with the calm patience that suggested his question wasn't about being unable to proceed, but rather was about wanting clarification or extension of something he'd been thinking about. Samuel acknowledged a raised hand and moved to Kiran's desk, expecting routine question about problem interpretation or calculation procedure. Instead, Kiran asked, "Mr. Hart, I understand how the angle bisector theorem works for triangles in 2 dimensions, but I was wondering, if you wanted to extend this concept to 3-dimensional shapes that aren't regular polyhedra, shapes with irregular faces and angles, how would you think about bisecting angles in 3 dimensions without having coordinate system to work with? Is there a geometric construction method that would work, or would you need different approach entirely?" Samuel stood beside Kiran's desk for a moment processing the question, feeling immediate recognition that this was a routine clarification question, but was instead substantive mathematical inquiry that he didn't have ready answer for. His first impulse was to offer some quick response that would sound knowledgeable even if it didn't fully address the question's complexity. Could have mentioned something about 3-dimensional coordinate geometry, or about how similar principles would apply in higher dimensions, or could have suggested that the question was beyond the scope of current course and could be explored later. These would have been pedagogically defensible responses that would have maintained his authority and would have allowed the class to continue without disruption. But something about Kiran's expression and about the genuine intellectual curiosity evident in how the question was posed made Samuel pause and reconsider his impulse toward quick dismissal or deflection. The question was exposing genuine limitation in his own mathematical knowledge. He'd taught the angle bisector theorem many times, had never had students ask about three-dimensional extensions, hadn't himself thought deeply about how the two-dimensional geometric principles he was teaching would translate to higher dimensions when coordinate systems weren't available as tools. The limitation wasn't about basic competence. He could certainly work through coordinate-based approaches if given time to think, but was about the kind of geometric intuition and creative mathematical thinking that Kiran's question was pointing toward. Samuel made a decision in that moment that he later recognized as pivotal. Instead of offering quick authoritative response that might not fully address the question's substance, he acknowledged his uncertainty and invited Kiran to share his own thinking. That's a really interesting question, Kiran. I have to admit, I haven't thought specifically about angle bisection in 3 dimensions without coordinates. Have you been thinking about this? What approaches do you imagine might work? The question created slight shift in classroom dynamics. Several nearby students who'd been working on their practice problems looked up with interest, recognizing from Samuel's tone that something unusual was occurring, that their teacher was engaging with student question in a way that suggested genuine intellectual exchange rather than just routine pedagogical interaction. Kiran appeared slightly surprised that his question was being taken seriously, and that he was being invited to elaborate rather than just receiving quick answer or dismissal. But he responded with increasing confidence as he began articulating the thinking he'd been developing. I was trying to visualize it, Kiran began, his voice quiet but clear. Like, if you imagine a 3-dimensional angle where 3 planes meet at a point like a corner of a room, and you want to bisect that 3-dimensional angle, you can't just use a compass and straight edge the way you would in 2 dimensions. But I was thinking maybe you could use the idea of equal distances. Like, if you think about all the points that are equidistant from the 3 planes that form the angle, those points would form some kind of surface that would represent the bisector. Samuel listened carefully, was processing not just the mathematical content of what Kiran was describing, but also the approach he was taking, was using spatial visualization and physical analogy rather than algebraic manipulation, was working from intuition about geometric relationships rather than from formal theorems or definitions. The approach was legitimate and was actually quite sophisticated, even if it wasn't yet fully rigorous, was demonstrating exactly the kind of creative mathematical thinking that formal education often struggled to develop, because curriculum was typically focused on learning established methods rather than on developing original approaches to novel problems. That's a really interesting approach, Samuel responded, his mind now actively engaged with the mathematical problem rather than just managing pedagogical interaction. So you're thinking about the locus of points equidistant from multiple planes as a way of defining the bisector. That makes geometric sense. The angle bisector in 2 dimensions is a locus of points equidistant from the 2 rays that form the angle. Extending that principle to 3 dimensions where you have planes instead of rays is a creative way to think about it. He paused, was now fully engaged with the problem, and was thinking aloud in ways that were making his own reasoning process visible to Kiran and to the other students who were listening. I think you'd need to be careful about how you define equidistance in 3 dimensions, whether you're measuring perpendicular distance to the planes or some other metric. And you need to think about what happens at the vertex point where the planes meet, whether the bisector surface passes through that point or approaches it asymptotically. But the basic intuition about using equal distances to define the bisector seemed sound. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Kiran and Samuel exploring different aspects of the problem, whether the bisector surface would be planar or curved, whether the approach would generalize to angles formed by more than 3 planes, whether physical models or computer visualization might help develop better intuition about the geometric relationships involved. Other students began contributing observations and questions. The practice period had transformed into an impromptu seminar on 3-dimensional geometry that was engaging students in ways that the original planned lesson hadn't achieved. Eventually, Samuel needed to redirect attention back to the scheduled practice problems and to the learning objectives for the day's lesson. But the experience had created something new in the classroom atmosphere. Students had witnessed their teacher engaging with genuine mathematical uncertainty, had seen that legitimate intellectual inquiry sometimes involved working through problems without having predetermined answers, had observed that even experienced teacher could learn from student who approached familiar topic from unfamiliar angle. That evening, after school had concluded and Samuel had returned to his apartment, he found himself continuing to think about the exchange with Kiran and about what it revealed about his own teaching practice and about his assumptions about teacher-student relationships. The immediate mathematical question about three-dimensional angle bisection was interesting, but was ultimately just specific technical problem that could be resolved through sufficient research and analysis. The more significant issue was what the question had exposed about the limitations of his pedagogical approach and about opportunities for deeper learning that he'd probably been missing throughout his teaching career. Samuel had always prided himself on being a competent teacher who possessed strong content knowledge and effective instructional methods. He thought of teaching primarily as process of transmission. He possessed mathematical knowledge and pedagogical expertise. Students lacked that knowledge. His role was to transfer understanding from his mind to theirs through clear explanations and well-designed practice opportunities. The model had worked reasonably well by conventional measures, had produced student learning outcomes that satisfied district expectations, and that seemed to serve students adequately for their subsequent mathematical coursework. But the interaction with Kiran was revealing limitations of his transmission-based conception of teaching. Kiran had been asking Samuel to transmit established knowledge that existed in textbooks or curriculum standards, had been asking genuine questions that emerged from his own mathematical thinking, that required creative problem solving and conceptual exploration rather than just recall of learned procedures. Samuel's expertise and experience had been valuable in facilitating that exploration, but the exploration itself had been initiated by student curiosity rather than by teacher-directed instruction, and the intellectual work of developing approaches to the problem had been genuinely collaborative rather than hierarchical. The experience was forcing Samuel to reconsider basic assumptions about classroom authority and about what effective teaching actually required. He had been trained to believe during his teacher preparation program, that maintaining authority and demonstrating expertise were essential to effective teaching, that students needed to see their teachers as knowledgeable authorities who could provide definitive answers and clear guidance. Acknowledging uncertainty or admitting that he didn't have immediate answer to student question had felt risky, had felt like potentially undermining his authority and creating doubt about his competence. But the actual result of acknowledging uncertainty and inviting student collaboration had been positive rather than problematic, had deepened student engagement, had modeled intellectual humility and genuine inquiry, had created opportunity for learning that wouldn't have occurred if he just provided a quick authoritative answer or had dismissed the question as beyond course scope. The recognition suggested that maybe his concerns about maintaining authority had been misguided, that maybe students actually learned better from teachers who were willing to engage with genuine uncertainty rather than always performing confident expertise. He spent several hours that evening researching three-dimensional angle bisection, found some technical literature on the topic that confirmed Kiran's basic intuition about using equidistant loci with sound approach, discovered that the problem was actually more complex than he'd initially appreciated, and involved interesting questions about different possible distance metrics, and about how bisection might be defined when dealing with irregular three-dimensional angles. The research was genuinely interesting to Samuel as mathematics, rather than just as pedagogical preparation, was reminding him that part of what had drawn him to teaching mathematics was his own genuine interest in the subject, rather than just his ability to explain it to others. Over the following weeks and months, Samuel's relationship with Kiran continued developing in ways that were transforming both participants' experiences of mathematics education. Kiran continued asking questions that pushed beyond standard curriculum and that required creative thinking rather than just application of learned procedures. Sometimes Samuel had ready answers or could guide Kiran toward established mathematical results, but often the questions opened genuine exploration where Samuel was learning alongside Kiran rather than just teaching him. The dynamic began affecting how other students in the class engaged with mathematics. Seeing that their teacher was willing to explore genuine questions and that intellectual authority didn't require having all answers immediately available made several students more willing to ask their own questions or propose their own approaches to problems, even when those approaches differ from methods Samuel had taught. The classroom atmosphere shifted from being primarily focused on learning established procedures toward being more genuinely inquiry-based, where students were developing their own mathematical thinking with Samuel providing guidance and structure rather than just direct instruction. Samuel began deliberately creating more opportunities for this kind of student-driven exploration. He started incorporating more open-ended problems that didn't have a single correct solution method, started asking students to develop and justify their own approaches rather than just following his demonstrations, started using student questions and observations as launching points for class discussions rather than always sticking rigidly to planned lesson content. The changes weren't a dramatic revolution of his teaching practice. He still provided direct instruction when appropriate, still maintained structured curriculum that covered required content, still assessed student learning through traditional methods when necessary. But his practice was becoming more flexible and more responsive to student thinking, was creating more space for genuine mathematical inquiry rather than just for mastery of predetermined procedures. The administrative and institutional responses to these changes were mixed. Samuel's department chair noticed that his students' performance on standardized assessments remained strong, were in some cases improving relative to previous years, which suggested that the more inquiry-based approach wasn't compromising students' mastery of required content. But some colleagues expressed concern that Samuel was spending too much class time on tangential explorations that weren't directly aligned with curriculum standards, that he was allowing individual students like Kiran to dominate class discussions in ways that might not serve the learning needs of students who were struggling with basic course content. Samuel took these concerns seriously, recognized that he needed to maintain balance between creating opportunities for advanced exploration and ensuring that all students were mastering foundational content. He developed strategies for differentiating instruction more effectively, would sometimes allow Kiran and other advanced students to work on extension problems, while he provided more direct support to students who needed help with core content, would sometimes break the class into smaller working groups that could proceed at different paces, would sometimes have after-class or lunchtime discussions with students like Kiran, who wanted to explore topics beyond standard curriculum without taking class time away from other students' needs. But he remained committed to the fundamental shift in his teaching philosophy that the experience with Kiran had initiated, the recognition that effective teaching wasn't primarily about transmitting knowledge from expert to novice, but was about creating environments where genuine learning could occur through inquiry and exploration and collaborative thinking. He'd come to see his role as a source of mathematical authority, and more as experienced guide, who could facilitate student learning by asking good questions and by helping students develop their own mathematical reasoning rather than just absorbing his. By the end of the academic year, the cumulative impact of these changes was evident in multiple ways. Kiran had thrived in Samuel's geometry class and had gone on to advanced mathematics coursework that put him several years ahead of typical grade-level sequence, was being discussed as candidate for participation in regional and potentially national mathematics competitions, was developing reputation as exceptionally talented young mathematician whose gifts were being appropriately nurtured. But Samuel recognized that his contribution to Kiran's development hadn't been about providing advanced instruction beyond standard curriculum. Kiran would likely have continued developing mathematically regardless of what kind of teaching he encountered. Samuel's contribution had been about creating an environment where Kiran's curiosity and creativity were valued and encouraged rather than being seen as disruptive or as demands for attention, about being willing to engage with genuine uncertainty rather than always performing expertise, about modeling that mathematical authority comes from reasoning and evidence rather than from position or credentials. Those lessons were valuable not just for Kiran, but for all the students in Samuel's classes, were teaching approach to learning and to intellectual work that would serve them well beyond just their mathematics education. Other students in Samuel's classes that year showed various responses to his evolved teaching approach. Some thrived on the increased opportunities for exploration and for developing their own mathematical thinking, reported in end-of-year evaluations that his class had been most engaging mathematics course they'd experienced, and that they developed deeper understanding of mathematical concepts than they'd achieved in previous courses that focused more on procedural mastery. Others struggle with the increased demands for independent thinking and with the decreased emphasis on being told exactly what to do, reported that they'd have preferred more structured traditional instruction that made clearer what was expected and that provided more explicit guidance about how to complete assignments. Samuel recognized that no single pedagogical approach would serve all students equally well, that his evolution toward more inquiry-based teaching was creating benefits for some students while potentially creating challenges for others, that effective teaching required ongoing adjustment and differentiation based on particular students' needs and learning styles. But he'd also come to believe that developing students' capacity for independent mathematical thinking and for intellectual inquiry was sufficiently important that it justified accepting some increased challenge and discomfort for students who were accustomed to more passive learning experiences. His own professional development had been significant. He joined Professional Mathematics Teacher Association and had begun attending conferences where he could learn about current research on mathematics education and could share his experiences with other teachers who were working to improve their practice. He'd started reading more contemporary mathematics, not just the high school level content he was teaching, but genuine mathematical research and exposition that reminded him that mathematics was a living field with ongoing developments rather than just static body of established knowledge. He'd begun writing reflectively about his teaching experiences, was documenting his evolving understanding of what effective mathematics education required, and was sharing those reflections with colleagues who were interested in improving their own practice. 5 years after that initial exchange about three-dimensional angle bisection, Samuel was still teaching at Elmwood High School, and Kiran had moved on to university, where he was pursuing undergraduate degree in mathematics with apparent intention of continuing to graduate study. They'd maintained occasional contact. Kiran would sometimes email Samuel with interesting mathematical problems he'd encountered or with questions about particular topics. Samuel would respond with what insights he could offer while also expressing genuine interest in learning about what Kiran was studying. The relationship had evolved from teacher-student to something more like mathematical colleagues with substantial difference in expertise, but with shared genuine interest in mathematics and in mathematical pedagogy. Kiran was apparently doing well in his university coursework, was being recognized by his professors as an exceptionally talented student who was likely to make genuine contributions to mathematical research if he continued on that path. In one email exchange, he mentioned to Samuel that he was considering pursuing graduate study in mathematics education rather than in pure mathematics, was interested in researching how mathematical creativity and intuition could be better developed through educational practices, was thinking about eventually becoming teacher himself because he'd realized through his own educational experiences that teaching could be genuine intellectual work rather than just transmission of established knowledge. Samuel found that development gratifying but also slightly humbling, recognized that Kiran's interest in mathematics education had been shaped partly by his experience in Samuel's geometry class, but that Kiran's understanding of effective teaching was probably already exceeding Samuel's own, even though Kiran had much less direct teaching experience. The recognition reinforced lesson that Samuel had learned from his initial interactions with Kiran, that intellectual authority and expertise weren't simply functions of age or credentials or experience, that genuine insight and wisdom could come from unexpected sources if you were willing to listen and to learn rather than always assuming that your existing knowledge and methods were adequate. Samuel's own teaching practice continued evolving, was now quite different in its fundamental orientation from what had been during his first decade at Elmwood. He was still teaching the same courses and covering the same required content, but the way he approached that teaching had shifted substantially. He saw his role less as knowledge holder who needed to fill students' minds with mathematical facts and procedures, more as facilitator who created conditions for students to develop their own mathematical understanding through guided inquiry and exploration. He was more comfortable with uncertainty and with acknowledging limitations of his own knowledge, was more willing to say, "I don't know, let's figure this out together," rather than always needing to provide immediate authoritative answers. The changes had made teaching easier exactly. In some ways, it was more demanding to facilitate genuine inquiry than to deliver well-rehearsed explanations, required more moment-to-moment responsiveness to student thinking and more willingness to deviate from planned lessons when student questions or observations opened worthwhile tangents. But it had made teaching more intellectually engaging and more personally meaningful, had reconnected Samuel with a genuine interest in mathematics that had originally attracted him to the field, had created relationships with students that felt more authentic and more educationally significant than the more hierarchical teacher-student relationships he'd maintained during his earlier years. He sometimes thought back to that October afternoon when Kiran had asked about three-dimensional angle bisection, recognized it as a pivotal moment in his professional development, even though it hadn't seemed particularly dramatic at the time. The question itself hadn't been revolutionary, was just thoughtful student asking genuine mathematical question that push beyond standard curriculum. But Samuel's choice to respond by acknowledging uncertainty and inviting exploration rather than by deflecting or dismissing had opened pathway toward different understanding of what teaching could be, had initiated a process of transformation that continued years later. True learning is never one-directional. The traditional model of education positions teachers as knowledge holders who transmit understanding to students who lack it, creates hierarchical relationship where intellectual authority flows from teacher to student without any reciprocal influence. But genuine education, the kind that develops actual understanding rather than just surface-level procedural mastery, requires more complex and more reciprocal relationship where both teachers and students are learning, where questions and insights can come from any participant regardless of their formal position, where intellectual authority is earned through reasoning and evidence rather than simply assumed based on credentials or experience. Samuel's experience with Kiran demonstrates that being open to learning from students doesn't undermine teaching authority, but actually strengthens it by grounding that authority in genuine intellectual engagement rather than in mere positional power. Students respect teachers who demonstrate genuine curiosity and intellectual humility more than they respect teachers who always perform confident expertise, even when that confidence isn't warranted. Creating classroom environments where student questions and observations are taken seriously and where teacher admits uncertainty, when appropriate, doesn't create chaos or undermine learning. It creates conditions for deeper engagement and for more authentic understanding than transmission-based instruction typically achieves. So be open to curiosity regardless of its source. If you're in teaching role, whether formal classroom teacher or mentor or anyone who's guiding others' learning, recognize that you can learn from those you're teaching, that their questions and perspectives can push your understanding further, that acknowledging uncertainty and exploring together is often more valuable pedagogically than providing quick authoritative answers. If you're in learning role, whether student or anyone who's trying to develop new understanding or capabilities, recognize that asking genuine questions and pursuing your own intellectual curiosity is valuable even when it pushes beyond what formal curriculum requires. That teachers who are worthy of respect will engage seriously with your questions rather than dismissing them as irrelevant or beyond scope. Be humble in guidance. Recognize that expertise and experience are valuable, but don't provide complete knowledge. That there are always aspects of any field that you don't fully understand. That intellectual growth requires ongoing learning rather than just application of already mastered knowledge. The humility isn't about false modesty or about pretending to know less than you do. It's about accurate assessment of the limits of your knowledge and about willingness to acknowledge those limits rather than performing certainty you don't actually possess. Be inspired by unexpected wisdom. Sometimes the most valuable insights come from sources you wouldn't have predicted, from students younger or less credentialed than yourself, from questions that initially seem naive or tangential, from approaches that differ from established methods you've always used. Remaining open to those unexpected sources of wisdom requires active effort to overcome the cognitive biases and institutional pressures that push toward assuming that expertise correlates perfectly with formal position and credentials. True learning is never one-directional. Be open to curiosity, humble in guidance, and inspired by unexpected wisdom. Be StoryWise,